Hey everyone, this is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I get to sit down and chat with other writers. And as you know, there is a soft spot in my heart for debut authors. In fact, I'm starting to do more work with the debut authors who are members of ITW, the International Thriller Writers, because I just have such a reflection of gratitude when I was a debut author about all the support I got. And there's kind of nothing like it when you see your book in print for the first time, your very first book in print for the first time, and to realize like you've manifested this dream that regardless of the size of the publishing house you're with, you've manifested this dream that very few writers get to realize. And to be able to do that, is something I remember very fondly. And so I've always had a soft spot for debut authors. And so I was very pleased today to talk to a fantastic debut author, at least debut in terms of fiction. Today I spoke to Edward Cahill. So Edward comes from the world of academia and has written academic texts before. And as he describes in our conversation, he kind of had this seminal moment where he was researching something and he was so interested in, there was so much information to convey that he had the epiphany of like, I can only really, I think, do this through fiction because I want a broader audience because this is such an important topic. And so that's what he set out to do. So a 4-year process of writing the novel, 2-year process or a year long to get an agent, then 2 years to sell it. Which is very common. And as I noted in our conversation, the only uncommon thing was he actually sold the book. Usually that all ends with just rejections and you're on to your second novel. But in this case, it's sold, and the name of the novel is Disorderly Men, and it just came out in early September. So it's a recent release as of the time of this recording. And it was fantastic to talk to him, to hear his perspectives on approaching what he wanted to write from a fiction angle, from a literary fiction angle, and then also the trials and tribulations of trying to sell something that's, in his terms, a relatively niche kind of topic or a niche audience. It's actually number one new release on Amazon in gay studies right now, which is phenomenal. But also just him realizing this story, I don't know how big of an audience the story is going to have, and going through the editorial rejection process of getting tremendously positive feedback on all aspects, but ultimately culminating with that phrase, "It's just not right for us at this time," which is always disheartening. But the book found a home, just came out, and obviously it's doing great. So I think, as I look back on our conversation, there are a lot of gold nuggets in this conversation from him for aspiring writers about kind of his process and what worked for him, and especially how he approached editing. So a lot of good stuff in this one. Very entertaining person. I really enjoyed my conversation. This is me talking to Edward Cahill.
Hey, Carter, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, buddy?
Well, pretty well, thank you.
Oh, good. Well, let's just get this out of the way. Congratulations on your debut release, which was a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah, September 5th was the pub day, and just finished reading in New York, San Francisco, and LA, and really happy with the result.
Wow, so you've been touring on it already?
Yeah. That's a brief one, but a fun one.
That's awesome. So how does everyone, I think every author, obviously dreams of having a novel published, and unfortunately, few ever realize that dream. But when you start down that publication road and it's a real thing, I think you have expectations, you have thoughts. How does it feel relative to what you'd been expecting, perhaps?
Well, we all expect to win the National Book Award.
I never did.
One person gets to win that every year. But it's been great. And, one of the most extraordinary things, and I think any artist experiences this, is for the first time when someone you don't know, when someone you've never heard of, who's not connected to you in any way, says, I read your book and it meant so much to me. That's an audience. And that's ultimately what a writer wants, is an audience. Your dad's going to say he loves the book, but when a stranger loves the book, that's something special.
Totally. My favorite is when a stranger tells me that I caused them to lose sleep because they were too scared. I'm like, oh, it warms my heart.
Yeah, or they stayed up all night long because they couldn't stop turning the pages.
Right.
Also warms my heart. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I pulled up the book on your book on Amazon today, and it was a #1 new release in gay studies, and that's phenomenal, man. That's quite an accomplishment. So so congratulations.
Thank you.
So where are you? Where do you live?
I'm in my apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in New York City.
Okay, you are nestled into Manhattan. Have you been there for a while? Have you lived there for some time?
Almost 30 years.
Oh, wow. It's about the same time I've lived in Colorado, which are two very different locations.
Yeah, I was born in San Francisco, where I just read, and I came here for grad school at Rutgers, and just decided New York City was going to be my home.
Yeah. Well, so you born and raised in San Francisco?
Well, born in San Francisco, raised in and around California.
Yeah.
Lived pretty much everywhere in California, but left in '93, and
okay. So not too dissimilar to me. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I left in '88 to go to New York for school, and never returned. Although I did live in San Francisco for a few years, and that's that's a hard city to leave, except for the cost of it, which you're no stranger to in New York, obviously.
It got a lot more expensive after I left.
Yeah. I remember I lived. It was my first job. Or my second job, I guess, out of school, and I was living in the Tenderloin, and it was just kind of starting to gentrify, but it was all I could afford, and it was fine, it was vibrant, but that was my real urban living experience, and that's actually when I got into reading because I didn't have any friends, so I discovered books.
Yeah, a lot of bookstores. At least there used to be a lot of bookstores. Yeah, and a lot of readers.
Yep. Well, very well educated city, obviously. So, so you're growing up in California, and you have siblings.
Had 2 siblings, no longer with us.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, and I was not much of a reader. In fact, I was a bad student.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't go to class. It was really only in my early 20s that I discovered books, and got it. And heard about this thing called grad school and academia, where they pay you to read books. And I thought that's a great idea. So I that route, got really lucky, and then found myself kind of returning to this long-standing desire to write fiction, which I'd always been too afraid to do when I was younger. And I tried a little bit. I sent my first stories to the Atlantic and the New Yorker, and surprise, surprise, they were rejected.
That's a bold first step.
Yeah, it's a bold first step. But I was working on my second scholarly book, sitting in the New York Public Library about 7 years ago, and something told me that I needed to take a different direction. So I put all my research aside and I started a novel.
Okay. So, all right. So I want to back up just for a second. So what was your undergraduate studies?
I have a bachelor's of science in business administration because it was what all my fraternity brothers were doing.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the easiest course. And I didn't find it in any way interesting.
So yeah, another parallel. I went to hotel school, which was essentially, I studied hotel real estate finance, and I was a hotel consultant for years and years and years before. Kind of like you, just like, I'm going to write a book and see what that feels like. Which is kind of an ill-advised move, but it's I contend that if you're a writer at heart, it'll come out of you kicking and screaming despite your best efforts to suppress it. But after your graduate work, you were writing scholarly texts. So you had the chops to write, although obviously that's a different kind of writing, right?
I mean, one thing that makes it possible to write a novel is if you've already written a book, if you've already managed a really big project with a million moving parts. And the PhD dissertation that became my first book was a history of early U.S. literature and aesthetics and politics, very specialized study. I'm sure no more than 25 people ever read it. I'm really proud of it. It was really fascinating stuff. But it involved just being in control of so many different pieces of a puzzle. And writing a novel requires that same amount of control of just a sort of an inundation of facts, of personalities, of ideas. And when you're writing at your best, you have to have all of those pieces in your mind at once, right? You have to have access to them if you want to write the best sentence, if you want to give the deepest character, you have to have them all there. And I think writing a scholarly book, even though it was a very different kind of writing, very different kinds of sentences, really taught me how to do that.
Yeah, I think it's important to have. So the actual act of writing, of writing sentences that are coherent and propulsive, that just takes practice over time. So you have to have practice at making an argument almost, in some kind of written form. But I think so. I don't outline. So to me, it's like, what's so great about a novel as opposed to maybe an academic text is who knows where it's going to go. Who knows? There's an infinite amount of possibilities where these characters can go if you don't have that idea already set in your head. And that's, to me, the joy of writing. But I'm curious to know, so I think everybody has that day, right? There's some kind of catalyst. And for you, you're sitting in the New York Public Library. Obviously, it's a tremendous atmosphere to have that sudden thought that you should write a novel, but that thought had already been there, probably buried. What was it that, was it just the desire to flesh out character or was it just, I have an idea that I think is so strong that I can't ignore it?
Well, my partner at the time was a fiction writer and a screenwriter, and we'd written a couple of screenplays together. Sold a couple of options.
That's fantastic.
That had kind of motivated me to be thinking creatively, but only as a sideline. And I think the moment was at some point I was moving from chapter 3 of this new book to chapter 4, which involved just burying myself in probably 150 historical books, and just so much work, and it just began to kind of click that this was going to be so much work. And all it was really interesting it was a cultural history of social mobility in the early modern Atlantic world. Really, really fascinating stuff. But I thought, at the very best, I'm going to get 100 readers, and I want more than that. And I want more people engaging with my ideas. And so I'd had an idea for a screenplay. My partner and I kicked it around for a while. He wasn't that interested in it, but it suddenly occurred to me this might be a novel. So I wrote 3 chapters with the promise that if they felt good and if it was a fun process, then I would turn those 3 chapters into 30.
So when you're writing, I'm curious to know, when you're kind of writing those screenplays with your partner, first of all, it's a challenge to co-write anything, I think. And you really have to mesh. But did you feel, because there you're really learning to write dialogue more than anything else. Are you feeling at that time, you're like, oh, I've got a pulse on dialogue. I didn't realize that. Or was there a competition almost of when you're co-writing those things?
Well, we had very different skill sets. I brought a lot of precision, and he brought a lot of originality.
Okay.
So when I first started writing fiction, I realized that writing a beautiful sentence does not make you a fiction writer. You need to be a storyteller.
Right.
And I was great for beautiful sentences, but I had to teach myself how to write a real story. And I think screenwriting did that, because you've got essentially 100 pages to tell that story.
Right.
Those scenes have to work so efficiently because nobody wants to stare at nothing. right? It's got to be moving constantly. And I think, it's not really that different from fiction. You can have your moments where you slow down the pace, but you've got to write with real compression and get as much meaning out of every sentence as you can.
Right. Being a writer isn't writing a beautiful sentence. Being a writer is deciding if you should keep that sentence or not, and having the humility to cut it, even if it's the most beautiful thing you've ever written. The floor is littered with darlings that I've killed, and it kind of feels good over time when you're just like, I'm chipping away, and now my manuscript, I think, is much better paced. And again, it depends on what you're writing. In the thriller community, obviously, you don't want the readers to catch their breath a whole lot, but it's also important to know when it's time for that to happen. So I'm curious, you approach a novel with a very information-rich background, and because your original idea was nonfiction, so you're talking about conveying a lot of information about a subject you're passionate about to an audience, and then by turning that to a novel, you kind of have to lose a lot of almost the research ego and know, okay, what does the audience really want to read about? And because you can tell when somebody overwrites research, right? It comes off the page of like, oh, okay, you're just showing off your research. How was that for you? Like, how were you having to make constant decisions about, this thing is really interesting, but it doesn't serve the story, so I can't write about it? Or
yeah, for me, there would be no greater humiliation than having someone say that he does not wear his research lightly. I was not going to stand for that. So there was a lot of absorbing and internalizing and then ignoring.
Yeah.
I wanted to learn this period. It's New York City, winter of 1962. I want to know everything about it, and then I want to forget everything about it so I can just kind of follow my impulses, and not really aim for a strict historical verisimilitude, but for a feeling, a feeling that feels like 1962. Because, it's really great that I've heard from a couple of historians that I got it right, but more importantly is that it doesn't interfere with the pleasure of the story.
Right, because historians aren't necessarily your target audience. In general, like you're never going to, there's always going to be somebody like, yeah, no, this was the wrong block that this was on, or whatever it is. And you're like, I don't care. I'm shooting for the 70% of you who just absorb the atmosphere as you would watching a Mad Men episode, of New York in 1962. And then you have to go ahead.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. But on the other hand, I wanted to get my history absolutely perfect. And I almost made a mistake. And my editor came through and he told me that the subway station in the Bronx that I had named was way too far from Danny's apartment, and he never would have been there. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's right. So I fixed the subway station, and I hope that was it. I hope I got it right.
That's what editors and copy editors are for. But I have a lot of friends who write, and the ones who write, who put a lot of research into their books, are people who just love to research. They just love it. I'm not one of those, because it feels like homework to me. But so that's part of the joy of the writing. But then again, it's figuring out how much to keep in there. And then the other part is, approaching novels. Like I have to craft a protagonist who people care about and see the world through this person's eyes, even though maybe it's an unrelatable character, or it's a time period that I wasn't alive in, or whatever. That's not easy to do. So you have to kind of distill it to like the human essence that everyone can connect to. How did you find, you wrote those first few chapters, where were you finding the biggest challenges for yourself?
Well, yeah, for me, reading fiction, fiction is a pleasure delivery system. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read. I wanted to write a book that was going to just fill my heart with all sorts of feelings. And so, I knew that I wanted not just one protagonist. I thought this is too much of a social phenomenon. The idea of gay oppression in the early 60s. We need to have some different perspectives. So in a lot of ways, I had taught so many novels. I knew what novels were. I knew how novels work. Executing them really meant finding a way to develop that interiority, to stay really, really close to a character, to know them well enough so that not only would I know what they would say, but I would know what they would do. I know what they wouldn't do. I would know how they would respond in this situation or that, which is all really basic to fiction writing. But it's the kind of thing, when you write your first novel, you're not just writing a novel, you're teaching yourself how to write a novel.
Totally. And a huge part of that is figuring out what person and what tense to use. So when I started writing out, I'm like, well, everyone, it seems to be everyone's writing third person past tense. So I was doing that for a while. Then it just I just started gravitating towards first person present. And that's a totally different style. But then you start to reveal like what your strength is. And when you talk about knowing a character and the intimacy, when you hit first person present, there's no way but being intimate with that person, because you are that person in essence as you're writing it. What approach did you use?
Yeah, as soon as you decide POV, a lot has been decided for you. I know a lot of writers who started in one POV and then realized it was the wrong choice. They got to back up and start again.
Yeah.
It depends on what you want to reveal in this character and how related are they to the world and to other characters, and how many other POVs do you want to get in there? What kind of a narrator do you want, kind of haunting this story? Do you want them really close to these characters or not? It's a lot of decision making, and I think you have to play around a little bit before you realize what's right. But I think for me, the best thing is just to trust. You just self-trust. You write it, you feel it, and you say, this feels right to me. And the way I keep writing pages every day is that they don't have to be good. That's my rule. They don't have to be good. And if I can take away that censor that insists that everything I do be good, that's when the good ideas happen. That's when the writing happens.
Right. Trusting your instinct is critical, and also knowing that you could be wrong and accepting that is important too, because there's a lot of times you don't really know until you start getting feedback. So my novel that's coming out in April, which is my ninth, the first time I've done this, I changed it from third person past to first person present, just because when I was writing, I'm like, I don't know if I can get in this person's head, because they're a 21-year-old female savant in 1987. And I was wrong. And so I had to change it all. But it took other people it took my editor really be like, I can't connect to this person. So it's a huge pain in the ass to do that. But like, you have to listen.
That's a big move. Yeah, that's a big move. And I think that, taking that kind of risk and getting that kind of feedback, right? It's an interesting dialectic between trusting yourself and then deciding how to trust what you hear from other people. Right.
Because, you could be in a critique group with 10 people, and over time you realize like, oh, you know what? There's really only 2 people that I trust their feedback. But when you're first starting out, like, if you start listening to all the input, which is all going to be going in different directions, you're going to have a very a flat story at the end of it. So you do have to trust. And so so you write this novel, and as you're writing it, do you have thought? You already have an agent in place? Do you have thoughts about an agent, or you just like, let me get this done and then see what happens next?
Yeah, it was just let me get this done. My partner read every chapter numerous times. But
that's hard too,
I kept getting this confidence that like, oh, this is good. This is good. Is this really good? Is this good? Wow. Took me a long time to believe it. Took me 4 years to write the book, a year to find an agent, 2 years to sell the book.
Yeah.
So it's a long haul.
But that's the norm. The only thing that's not normal about your story is that you actually sold the book.
Yeah.
Or that you got an agent. So for example, like, I got an agent after 70 rejections with my first novel, but my first 3 novels didn't sell. And it's just a matter of, okay, I love to storytell and I just want to keep at this. So did your agent, once your agent accepts you and accept your book, they're already kind of bought in, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of feedback. Were there rewrites after getting that agent?
My agent gave me some really, really good notes, but not a ton.
Mm-hmm.
And my editor gave me some really good notes, but not a ton. And so it really kind of inspired me to do an editorial process on my own for about three or so months before I turned in the final manuscript. And I moved up into an apartment in the Hudson Valley, and I just kind of hunkered down. And
you went real Thoreau.
I tuned my brain to first time I've ever read this thing, and I really just listened to it. I just listened really, really carefully, and it was a fantastic process. And it gave me a lot of confidence, I think, in my ability to edit my own work. I'd love to have I love getting other people's feedback, but I think it's really important to learn how to listen to your own work, to listen to how it sounds when you read it out loud, and to know the difference between a sentence that almost works and a sentence that really sinks.
Yeah. And it's hard to develop that perspective because you're looking at this in these 3 months. You're like, well, I've already spent 4 years writing this and rewriting it so many times. It is easy to kind of second guess yourself. Like, what if I'm making this worse by editing it again? And your brain is in a different, place now than it was 4 years ago. So your attitudes towards life. And so you could really, I think it's easy to move the novel away from where you intended it to be simply through your own human development over time. So I think reading that out loud probably makes a big difference. I've never had quite the patience to do that for a full book of mine, but I've heard it's very helpful to do that.
It takes a lot of patience, but I think it's really listening to yourself. If you're editing your work and you're panicking a little bit, that's the time to stop and go do something else, right? Mm-hmm. If you're worried, oh my gosh, this isn't right, I don't know what to do, that's the time to go, go read a book or go take a walk.
Yeah.
But if you're really listening to yourself and it's like you're seeing right through the text, you're seeing exactly what it is and exactly what needs to change.
Yeah.
And that's a feeling of to me, that's what self-trust feels like. It's very, very calm and you know exactly what to do.
Yeah. And that's not always achievable. And they always say, the old axiom obviously is like, put your manuscript in your desk drawer for 6 months. But that's the luxury of people who have a lot of different projects and are selling those projects all the time. Like for me, I was just like, no, I want to edit it. I finished the first draft and the next day I'm editing that draft.
Yeah.
And so you do lose a little bit, I think, from that, but you also don't really have much of a choice if you're like, I want to get this to my agent or to my editor. So as your agent is shopping this manuscript, what was that process like? Was it immediate success? Did it take a while?
Yeah, it was 2 years. We went to all players, and it's a hard time to sell literary fiction. It's just a really, really hard time. So in a lot of ways, it was a really positive experience. It was lots of really wonderful notes. I love the story. I love the characters. This is a great novel, and I'm sure it's going to land at some fine home somewhere. Unfortunately, it's not quite mine. And I asked my agent, like, what does that mean? Why does everybody love me, but they don't love me enough to marry me? And she said it's a business, and they do a calculation, and that calculation is also a guess, right? They're trying to guess, what the book buying audience of literary fiction, which is pretty specific. Mine's a gay novel, so it's even more specific. Mm-hmm. What they're looking for and what's going to generate income for the corporation that publishes books, which is probably why I ended up at a small independent press. It's a tough thing, and I think it's a miracle. It's a miracle if you can sell a novel. So
it absolutely is a miracle. And the business side of it has always been fascinating to me because I come from a business world, and you start looking at the publishing industry in all of its opacity, and you're like, how does anything actually get done? because like you said, they're all guessing, and it's really not much more scientific than that. When you start peeling away the layers, and you're like, oh, okay, they just don't know. And they think like, okay, best case scenario is 10,000 copies with X novel. And is that enough to break even? Is that, whatever. But you also realize like, they don't look at everything that it's going to be a bestseller. A lot of publishing houses are thrive on their mid-list authors who just produce. But it's frustrating as an author because you don't know what you don't want to hear when you're getting those rejections is like the writing wasn't good.
You don't want to hear that. You don't want to hear that. In fact, I mean, I got to say, I was happy with a lot of these rejections. I took them as just real compliments. I thought, wow, if some top editor at some top press thinks that what I'm doing is worthwhile, then that's a delightful surprise.
Oh no, it's just weird that some New York editors actually reading your book.
Yeah, but they did. They took it seriously. So
yeah, well, that's because you have a reputable agent, and that's the power of the agency is that they will get you in those doors.
That's right. Yeah, it may be that the harder thing to do is to get the good agent.
Yeah, or to get any agent. Like I think my agent told me not too long ago, and she's just an independent agent. I've been with her for 20 years. That she gets 20 to 30 queries a day, and she takes on one author per year typically. And I'm like, Jesus, those are good odds for anybody.
It's a rejection business. The whole business is a rejection business.
Right, it is. And the key to it as an author, one of the keys is to embrace that rejection and to be curious about it and to study it. Like you were saying with your letters, like, okay, not only is it a compliment, but sometimes they tell you why it's not the right fit for them. And maybe it's just, they're not pursuing that specific brand of whatever you're writing at the time. But sometimes it's like, your hero wasn't quite strong enough for us. And if you start seeing a lot of those same comments, that's tremendous, that's gold for the writer to have these top editors giving you advice. It's a free course.
Yeah. On the other hand, I'd also get, the pace is a little too slow, or I wish you would really slow down the pace and we could kind of, get to know these characters a little bit more. Too many POVs, more POVs. A lot of times the feedback was contradictory. And in that way, just a reminder that these are people, these are people with their own opinions, and, you find what's useful in the feedback, but not all of it's going to be.
Totally. And the end result of that is you want that editor who not only sees your book as a viable business interest, but is passionate and is a champion for your book. And I know that sounds like a very obvious thing to say to the listeners, but the reality of it is some books get taken on that are just like, yeah, this rounds out this catalog, but you get largely ignored as an author. And as an author, it's very hard to say like, well, I don't feel like you're championing my book enough, so I'm not going to go with you. You kind of just jump at any opportunity, but you really do want that passion.
Yeah. So Disorderly Men is the first work of original fiction by Fordham Press. And that told me that they were going to be excited about it. They were going to, really be committed to it. That they understood that it had to be sold a little differently than, a scholarly book, a lot differently. And I got the same enthusiasm from my wonderful agent, Pamela Malpas. She just made it clear that she loved the character, she loved the story, she loved my writing, and I still get goosebumps when I think about that kind of support. But it really does make all the difference, because it's a long slog, and it's not always a remunerative slog.
It's quite often not.
It is quite often not. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the reality of the industry, which is why, if you're pursuing fiction writing, you're doing so out of love and passion and joy, and not saying I'm quitting my day job because this is going to make me $1 million. I mean, to go in with eyes wide open is the best advice you can get. And also, like, it's interesting in your case with a publisher, this is their first work of fiction. you know, they have to do things differently now in terms of marketing the book. And that also means you have to step up as the author. And I mean, the author does anyway, regardless of if you're with the big five or not. And you have to really make a presence for yourself, which is not something everyone's comfortable doing.
No, it's very different from writing, right? Writing is very solitary and very kind of insular, and I'm really comfortable doing that. And
me too.
Right now I'm just pretending to be a really gregarious person who loves, being interviewed.
You're doing well.
But I've had to kind of step up, as we say, and sell, and not just to sell the book, but to sell the ideas, to sell the history,
to sell you,
to sell me, and to be a storyteller, a public storyteller. I never thought I would enjoy doing the book readings as much as I did. I found it was really just kind of like teaching in the classroom. I've got a bunch of students here. They're all there. They seem interested. I start talking. Pretty soon a conversation happens. And that's what I do. That's what I do every day.
Yeah. And that's because you have that experience as a teacher. The basics of the public speaking and being in front of an audience and conveying a message. And that's, that does sound very fundamental, but that most authors don't have that. And that's one of the things I teach, for example, when I'm teaching writing, I teach public speaking as well. Because I'm like, your job doesn't end when you finish the story. You are part of this team, just as you would be in any other business, that you have to sell the book. And having a presence is a big part of that. And that's a real struggle for a lot of people. So it's a matter of being a presence and also knowing what you're good at and what you're comfortable with, and then staying away from the stuff that you're terrible at, because it'll show.
I did not try any TikTok videos. Actually, no, I did. I tried to make one. It was really lousy, and I decided I was never going back there again. So.
A clip of this will be on TikTok eventually, because that's most of my TikTok feed is clips of this show where people can learn.
That will be my
your foray into TikTok. Yeah. But yeah, and you don't have to do TikTok. You don't have to, but it is but it's so interesting nowadays, because I can guarantee you when your agent was shopping your book, editors were Googling your name. They wanted to see what kind of presence Edward Cahill has. And yeah, it's pretty crazy, and you have to keep it up, and it's not cheap either. So that's the journey you have ahead of you, is becoming a social media champion.
Well, I'm about 100 pages into my next novel, really, really excited about it, and kind of frustrated when I have to put it aside to do 2 hours social media every day, but I have to do it because that's the job, and I want readers for the first book. But yeah, it's a different kind of work, and it's a little bit of a trade-off.
Yeah, totally. And also getting involved in the community that's relevant to whatever it is you're writing. Going to conferences and seminars and doing panels and things like that, where you're getting known amongst your peers and not just your readers. And that begets so many things down the road once you have that community.
On Sunday, I'll be at the Brooklyn Book Fair, signing copies of Disorderly Men, and hopefully meeting new readers.
Yeah, absolutely. And your recent travels were successful?
Yeah, I mean, really, really just so much fun. I was at Fabulosa Books in San Francisco and Chevalier's Books in Los Angeles. And I was at the Center, the Bureau of General Services Queer Division bookstore at the Center on 13th Street in Manhattan. Standing room only crowd.
Wow.
Time. Really, really, really great time. Yeah.
That's great. But you'll really cut your teeth with the non-standing room only crowds when there's 3 people there or less. and then you're like, okay, I got to switch into this mode, and I don't,
Yeah. Well, the turnout in Los Angeles wasn't quite as good. So that was, I've heard the horror stories. I don't think I quite experienced the horror, but it was definitely a smaller crowd and had to play that a little differently.
My publisher flew me to Houston to do a signing at Murder by the Book, and it was promoted for weeks, and 0 people showed up. There wasn't even anyone randomly in the bookstore looking at books. And so I just talked to the owner for like half an hour, and I'm like, I'm going to go get dinner now. But now I've got that story.
Now you've got the story. You walk out of there with your head held high.
Well, listen, Ed, we're going to wrap up soon, but before we do, we are going to do our storytelling part of the show. I've chosen 3 books, mostly at random from my bookshelves. I'm going to have you pick one of those books, and we're going to choose a random page and a random sentence. I will read that sentence, and then that will be the first sentence and maybe a 2-minute long short story. So I'll read the sentence. You give me the next couple sentences of what happens. I'll do a couple, and then it'll be a complete disaster, and then I will kill it eventually. Okay. So I have John Jakes, The Bastard. I got really into John Jakes living in San Francisco, reading in my 20s. I remember that's when I discovered John Jakes. Grisham's Rainmaker, and a book fully written in the second person. Then we came to the end.
I think you had me with The Bastard.
So choose geez, I forgot how long this was. Choose a page between 1 and 600.
Well, let's make it 300 then.
Okay. You are precise, aren't you? I will quickly look and just see if there's a sentence that might work. All right, I'm just going to read this, and then this can go wherever the hell we want it to go. Caleb gestured to the other chair, then to a platter of biscuits.
He thought about eating one, but then decided it might be rude. So he waited, and he waited, and he waited, but she sat there staring at him, saying nothing.
It was then that the smallest seed of doubt, the smallest seed of could even be hate, started to creep into his mind. Why wasn't she eating the biscuits? She had made them after all, and she was so insistent that he have one first.
He'd known her all his life, and he knew that if he were to take the biscuit and eat it, that she would win. So instead he reached for a cup of tea, and he drank the entire cup of tea in a single gulp.
It took about 2 minutes for him to realize he had made a terrible, terrible decision. Avoiding the biscuits and going for the tea seemed reasonable until he started to feel flush in his cheeks and a little bit dizzy. And suddenly there was a small pain in his chest near his heart.
It was the inheritance, he knew at that moment, the inheritance. They were the only 2 heirs left. They had discussed an equal division of the property. It was clear in the will that he would have half of the estate. But as his stomach began to churn and churn, and he felt his very insides dissolving, he knew that he ought to have eaten that biscuit.
The teacup fell from his hand, shattered on the floor. She was so cool. She just looked at the broken shards of porcelain and said, "That was supposed to be my teacup." We'll call it there.
Very, very nice.
It immediately goes to murder. I don't know why. That's what usually happens. Maybe it's because I'm a thriller, but there's usually death imminent in these 2-minute long short stories.
Well, I think if there hadn't been some death, then the teacup and the biscuits might have gotten a little boring. So
the last thing you want is boring biscuits. Well, listen, Ed, what a pleasure talking to you. And I'm excited for your recent release, and congratulations. It's such a, and you seem to have that healthy perspective of being able to look back and be like, damn, that actually happened. It actually, because it really doesn't happen for the vast majority of writers. So to be able to look back, even though you're continuing forward, but be able to look back and have that gratitude and have that perspective, I think is so important for authors.
I think that's exactly right. I feel so grateful. And I think, anyone who can get pleasure out of writing can have access to that gratitude, because it really is, it's a cliche, but it is its own reward. And if you're gonna pursue it, that pleasure really has to be the most important thing. And it was a real pleasure to meet you, Carter. Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. Talk to you soon. I hope to meet you in person someday.
Me too. Take care.
Take care, Ed. Bye. So that's it. That is my conversation with Edward Cahill. He was fantastic, and I liked our little story at the end there. It might have been a little bit on the nose, but I always am partial to a good story about poisoning. It's just my nature. If you want to find out everything you can about Ed, please go to his website. It's just edwardcahill.net. There you can read about him, buy his books, find his social media connections, all that good stuff. And if you want to find out more about me, just hop on over to my website, carterwilson.com. And I will say, I just had the website refreshed to reflect my upcoming novel. So it's bitchin'. It is a very bitchin' website right now. Shout out to Zuni, who does tremendous work. I think I've been with Zuni for, over 12 years now. So good stuff. That is it for now. There are more episodes of Making It Up Soon coming out, and there will be one out next week. And in the meantime, thanks as always for watching and or listening. Take care.